So if we were sitting inside the Beltway instead of in Benjamin Franklin Hall, Norman Ornstein would need no introduction. But since we're here, I will briefly introduce him. Norman Ornstein is a resident scholar with the American Enterprise Institute, a contributing editor and columnist of National Journal and The Atlantic, and an election analyst for BBC and for many other outlets. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. He's a longtime observer of Congress and politics and participates in the AEI's Election Watch series. He led a working group of scholars and practitioners that helped shape the law known as McCain-Feingold, which, for one brief shining moment, reformed the campaign finance system until, my material doesn't tell me this, but until it was overturned by Citizens United. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and his many books include The Permanent Campaign and Its Future from 2000, The Broken Branch, How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track, with Tom Mann, published in 2006, and most recently, also with Tom Mann, a New York Times bestseller, presciently called It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. I last saw Norm Ornstein in the interval between the election and the inauguration, most recently, at a meeting in Washington, at which he offered some apocalyptic predictions about what was to come, and I'm very interested to hear whether he thinks the apocalypse has arrived, and in his talk called Surviving Trumpism.
Thank you, Linda. I actually had a question for Martin. In the revision of the succession, did the brother of the king say, "Only I can fix it"? Actually, I did this book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism in 2012. A revised version came out in 2016 called It's Even Worse Than It Was. And I thought about doing the next one, Run for Your Lives, but I'm actually have a book that's just being finished with E.J. Dionne and Tom Mann, which we are calling One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned. I would like to start with a moment of silence for the victims of the Bowling Green Massacre and the Swedish Massacre. And I'm just gratified that the new commission headed by Frederick Douglass will get to the bottom of all of this. I've got a lot more jokes, but I only have 20 minutes, and there's so much to do, and there's so many areas that I could cover. And what I think I'd like to do is basically try and touch on four things. The first and the most important, getting at what Linda said in the introduction, I believe we face an existential threat to our way of life and to some of the fundamental threads of the society right now. I saw that David Brooks in his column the other day said that we've gone, if you look at the challenge from 1 to 10, from an 11 down to where he's reassured that we're at a 3 or a 4. I'm at 11, and in part because I believe that the safeguards that we have in the system to guard against the kind of threat, safeguards that were very deliberately put in place by framers, are under siege because you can have a constitution, you can have laws, you can have rules, but it's the norms that matter, and that's a real challenge. And I think we face a threat of governance that is along three lines: an autocracy, a kleptocracy, and a kakistocracy. And for, there are very few crowds at which you don't have to explain what kakistocracy is. This, I'm sure, is one, but for those who may not know, it's actually an old word. It comes from a Greek word, and it means government by the least among us, by the most mediocre. It comes, as I understand it, from a word that actually means caca. But They're all there right now. At the same time, it's not just a threat to governance, but it's a threat to societal cohesion. Because the fact is that we are facing what I think, at least in our lifetimes and probably going back to the 1850s and 1860s, is a set of fissures in the society that are racial and ethnic, that are partisan, and that partisan is, and music even, is tribal, that are regional in nature, but also have cultural and residential divisions that are starker than we have seen in a very, very long time. And I'll come back to some of those, but I think it's also important to say that this threat emerges with Donald Trump. And yesterday, as we approached the 100 days, was a typical one. He addressed the National Rifle Association and basically went back to brag about the campaign and to raise all the old wounds again and to call Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas, and at the same time did an interview in which he said that he didn't realize that this would be so hard, that he'd have to work harder than he did when he was in business, and called the Constitution archaic. And the only positive thing emerging from that is I had no idea he knew what the word archaic was. But this is not simply about Trump, because the fact is that Trumpism has longer and deeper roots, some of these going back a very, very long time. And of course, we've had an American society from the beginning that's had many of these divisions, and we've had to fight through multiple periods of governing crisis and dysfunction, of a society coming apart at the seams, of a party going completely off the rails, and we've managed to come back, sometimes in 10 or 15 or 18 years, sometimes a little bit longer. But the contemporary roots, I would argue, go back not only beginning perhaps with a dramatic regional realignment of our politics that started in the 1960s, started with Barry Goldwater, moved on through the Voting Rights Act, and continued forward, but also, and most particularly, with the emergence of Newt Gingrich in the late 1970s and a belief that the only way Republicans could win a majority in the House of Representatives, in which Democrats had had a stranglehold for decades, was to tribalize our politics, nationalize our elections, and convince people that Washington and governance were so awful that anything would be better than this. And that continues to reverberate in our culture and otherwise. And now, as we've gone through various iterations of this, with, of course, Gingrich succeeding when there was a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, who could be delegitimized, and in a process of creating a parliamentary minority party, in effect, in a system that doesn't tolerate those things, to create and enhance that level of anger that continued on through and was amplified by the Obama presidency. But we now have a couple of additional phenomena, some that are also familiar to us. The angry populism, which has been there back and forth since the beginning of the Republic. And it's no secret or coincidence that Donald Trump has a picture of Andrew Jackson on the wall and went to visit his gravesite, because Jackson is a role model, and of course Jackson's presidency, which emerged with an enormous backlash against the elites in Washington from the corrupt bargain where he believed his presidency had been stolen in 1824, and then governed as a populist, and in a way that I find somewhat frightening, continued to be venerated right up to the present day, where he's on the $20 bill, and Democrats continue to have annual dinners that are the Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners, for somebody venerated because he was a strong, tough leader, but of course also pursued virtual genocide among Native Americans, was not only a slaveholder, but basically proudly talked about how this was the linchpin of our society. So a role model of many different sorts. And the populism that we have now is a sharper one that we've seen in a very, very long time, because of the nature of the financial collapse and the bailout that followed. But it also is a product of partisan tribalism. And just for a minute, let me say polarization, which is what we hear about the most, which is real. And we have seen in the decades that I've been in Washington a collapse of the center and a movement towards the extremes. But you can be polarized ideologically and still manage to find ways in our political system to solve problems. And indeed, the framers weren't necessarily thinking along the lines of, they certainly weren't thinking along the lines of partisanship, but they understood there'd be sharply different viewpoints and created a system of debate and deliberation, bringing people together face to face to make that work. And with things like the odd partnership and friendship between Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch that gave us the Children's Health Insurance Program, operating from the polls, not from the middle, but finding ways to work in that tradition, we could make it work. But what's happened over the last couple of decades, encouraged by Gingrich and by others who followed and amplified dramatically by the so-called young guns in the Republican Party in Congress, including Paul Ryan, Kevin McCarthy, and Eric Cantor, and Mitch McConnell, it moved to become tribal. Tribal is where you believe if you're for it, I'm against it, even if I was for it yesterday, and where you no longer view people on the other side of the aisle as adversaries, but as the enemy trying to destroy your way of life. And what we've seen in our politics and our culture in the country is that the tribalism that began fairly consciously in Washington metastasized out to the states and now has moved out quite substantially to the public as a whole. We are driven in our elections, as much of our research shows, by negative partisanship, not by a positive attachment to one's own party, and that helps to explain, if you put the populism and the tribalism together, how a Bernie Sanders could emerge, a guy who'd never been a Democrat a day in his life, and attain a very substantial following in the party, and how a Republican Party could have a whole series of outsiders. Donald Trump, of course, had as many partisan identities as wives, and talked a few years ago about how if he ever ran for president, he'd run as a Republican because they'd believe anything that he would say anyhow. And that was of no great concern to people who otherwise would have been more interested in their partisanship. Now, I can go back and go through all of these different elements, the dangers of autocracy, the reality of kleptocracy. And among the most astonishing things is we have never had a president who has so in-your-face blatantly used his office from day one in violation of the law and two constitutional clauses on emoluments with no pushback whatsoever, and who continues to do it on a daily basis, and who's gotten the other levels of government to flack for him, the State Department now advertising Mar-a-Lago, among other things. The kakistocracy, where we have no concern with running a government, incompetent and dishonest people often put in charge, and 100 days in, 20 of the 1,000 positions that are Senate confirmable, the 700 or so that are actually policy making, the 550 that are serious policy making, actually filled with people. And speaking of kakistocracy, the news at least reported today that Seb Gorka, who is in the White House in a foreign policy position with a background in Nazism with apparently a phony PhD, they are now going to move him out of a national security position and are trying to find another spot for him inside the government. That pretty much defines kakistocracy to me. But I would just say more broadly, we are in uncharted territory here. We have never had a president ever with no experience coming in governance, who's occupied no position. We've had presidents who had limited experience. We've had generals. Perhaps in many ways the closest analogy is Abraham Lincoln with one term in the Congress. But Lincoln, as we know, was aware of that deficiency and filled his government with people, the gang of rivals as we know, people who were his bitter rivals who had that level of experience. Instead, we have a chief of staff who's had nothing to do with the federal government, one term in the Wisconsin legislature, and then a party hack and a chief advisor and a secondary advisor, Steve Bannon and Steve Miller, with limited experience, and a cabinet filled with people who've never worked in government before. Now, for a lot of Americans, this fills a sort of cultural meme. Why can't we run government like a business? And we are running government like a business, but that business is Trump University at this point. At the same time, I will say that in the almost 50 years that I've been in Washington, I've had the privilege of getting to know some presidents fairly well, and I've watched others very closely. Every president is transformed the moment he has seen that he's won the presidency. And to me, the best example is George Herbert Walker Bush. Nobody could have had more experience coming into that office. He had served in Congress. He'd been ambassador to the United Nations. He had been ambassador to China. He had been the head of the CIA. He'd had 8 years as vice president there in the Oval Office when the decisions were made. And the moment he became president, it was different. He wasn't just in the room. He was going to be the one responsible for those decisions, responsible for the lives and well-being of not just 300+ million Americans, but billions of people around the world. This is the first president unchanged in any way upon assuming the presidency, and unchanged in any fundamental way 100 days in. To be utterly frank, we have a 70-year-old lifelong narcissistic sociopath as a president. And whether we find ways to provide those boundaries and balances is a challenge. There's a deeper challenge, I think, though, more broadly. Because Trump, who won with a minority of votes, whose level of support now is at roughly 35% or so, 35 to 40%, is doing something else that other presidents have not done, and that is focusing only on his supporters to the detriment of everybody else. He is not trying, and hasn't tried from the beginning, to broaden that base. And what that is doing is further tribalizing the society. And if I had more time, I would go into the dramatic changes in telecommunications and in other elements in the society that have created these closed information loops and have driven us further apart. Just to give you, though, one example of the world we live in now and how tribal identities and communications have changed things. If you looked at the bombing of Syria and the approval of our policies towards Syria, when Barack Obama drew the red line and then didn't bomb, and people were asked whether they approved of his policies, 37% of Democrats did and 22% of Republicans. When Trump bombed, 38% of Democrats approved, 86% of Republicans. So we live in completely different worlds now with actions taken. And at the same time, we are part, and we're seeing all of the divisions that we've had in our society with parallels elsewhere, with deeper and deeper divisions. More and more in our country, we are moving into just firmly red states and firmly blue states, all of which means that an electoral system with an electoral college built on the notion that you would have to appeal to all states, that reason for having that system so that people would campaign all over the country in smaller areas and in larger areas to build those majorities, that no longer works anymore. And there's a substantial bias towards smaller rural areas. What we're seeing all over the globe is a growing division between big cities and cosmopolitan areas and smaller towns and rural areas. You could see this in the first round of the French voting. We've seen it in a whole lot of other places. Populism is working out that way, a deeper resentment of those outside of cities, which are the engines of growth in most of our places, and the engines of intellectual activity, and those who have felt left behind here with the added element of the racial identity. But along with that, within states, we're seeing more and more counties and areas that are becoming overwhelmingly one party or another. The big sort, the fact that we are basically in contact only with people who believe what we believe, makes these divisions that much harder to deal with. And all of that, with the partisan tribalism, means that Donald Trump aside, and whatever happens to Donald Trump further down the road, if we can get past the dangers of an emerging autocracy or potentially emerging autocracy or a bombastic foreign policy leading us in a difficult direction, we are still going to have the residue of a set of divisions that make the ability to take an extended republic and create that sense of legitimacy in governance a much, much bigger challenge than we have faced, I believe, at any time since the Civil War and its aftermath. And at the same time, what we're seeing in that erosion of norms is a Congress that is as disappointing and as frightening as almost anything else that we have seen. It is disappointing because the fundament for the norms of restricting autocratic and bad behavior by a president or by another leader start in Congress. That's the check and balance. Not a single hearing or a single movement to deal with the kleptocratic problems. An attempt to basically push all the issues surrounding Russian involvement in the election out the door and move it into the back order. But at the same time, in a complete lack of concern with the normal process of governing. Reading stories the other day about the people involved in the healthcare system, the physicians, the hospitals, the insurers, and the other providers in trying to reach leaders in Congress as they're putting together their new iteration of their healthcare plan, and being told that they were not welcome at the table because they would bring data, and that data would go against the entire element of what they were trying to put together. If you look back at Newt Gingrich when he became Speaker, demolishing the Office of Technology Assessment precisely because facts and figures would go against the ideological beliefs that has led to, that was really the linchpin of the war on science. And now a lack of concern with focusing on the people who will be affected by policies that will be made, but who also know what the impact of those policies would be, tells us that we're not going to be able to do what the framers believed would happen, which is you'd bring people from disparate viewpoints together in a Congress, not a parliament, to debate and deliberate and over time organically reach decisions that would be seen as legitimate decisions by the public as a whole. If you don't have legitimacy in an election system, not just because of an electoral college, but because of a belief that the system is rigged, if you don't have a legitimacy in the presidency, and if you don't have a sense of legitimacy that decisions are being made the right way, and you layer that on top of the deeper divisions that I've talked about in the society, bringing that back together is going to be an immense challenge. I'll just end by saying that, of course, the election could have come out the other way. And we know pretty firmly now that if not for the two Comey letters, I'd be up here if I had been invited talking about the challenges of governing for a Hillary Clinton eking out a surprisingly narrow electoral vote victory with 279 electoral votes, possibly facing a tied Senate and a Republican majority in the House, and all of the dysfunction that's been building for the last few decades there. And we could talk about the difficulty with the challenges facing a country and a world where the jobs that we've expected will not be there, where the challenges to the university system and the education system and the racial divisions and stagnant incomes and the yawning inequality and all of that would be difficult. All of those challenges will be there after Donald Trump is gone. And it's incumbent upon all of us to try to find ways to begin to get a different dialogue going, to damp down the tribal identities that people are feeling, to move us away from sectarian divisions, but also to repair a political system that has lost its way. So I always end now with an upbeat. Have a nice day.
Well, There's going to be a lot of questions, and I don't want to hog the time, but I'll just ask you one question. So
I would be stunned if you didn't have a question.
Our next general membership meeting here at the APS is next November, and a year from then is the 2018 midterm elections. So looking ahead, do you have any sense of whether any rationality can be extracted from the midterms?
So that's a long time away in many ways. I will say there are a couple of heartening things that have happened. You know, the safeguards that we have in the norms are not just in the governing institutions, they're in civil society. And we have seen some movements in civil society, some of which obviously started at the time of the inaugural, the Women's March and the other marches that were at least a signal of people being upset. But marching is one thing, and whether that's sustained until a year from November is another. You know, there's a cultural difference between the left and the right in many ways. If you look at the aftermath of the bailout, we got the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Tea Party movement. And the Occupy movement occupied. And for 2 months, they sat there in their tents across from Wall Street and across from the Fed and across from the White House. And then it got pretty gamey, and they took the tents down and they left. And that was that. And it was, I did my part. I sat in the tent. And the Tea Party movement organized. Now it's a question of whether the left will organize, but it's also a question of whether you're going to see a Republican Party with any of its elements begin to respond in a different way. And that means candidates running against some of the more extreme candidates, and it means changing the narrative a little bit. Now, at the same time, we've had lawyers emerge with the immigration issue. We've had, I think it's been the finest moment for the legal profession that I have ever seen, and they needed a fine moment. We're seeing other professions emerge and try and create a different climate, and we'll see with these special elections too. But the problem in the past has been that turnout in midterm elections is tilted in a Republican direction. It's older, it's more male, it's more white. What's the motivation this time? Will the anger be sustained over 2 years? And will we be able to make sure we do not get more voter suppression laws or efforts that will only worsen the notion of a sense of illegitimacy?
Yeah.
Right now, I think there's a good chance that we could see a counterweight in those midterms.
Okay.
In the balcony, and then here.
Where, balcony?
Balcony, and then here.
Yes, Larry Einhorn, Indiana University. Thank you for the excellent upbeat presentation
Yes.
there. So before we have the zombie apocalypse coming up over here, do you think, you mentioned Congress, is there really no profiles in courage anymore? Are they viewing Trump as Darth Vader? What's holding, why don't they go against him, even things like climate change? They surely can't believe all the things he says.
I am deeply disappointed. You know, you remember during the campaign, Lindsey Graham said there comes a time when you put a country ahead of party. And so you can use that as a template. And we're not seeing very many times when that appears to be the case. And I think you've got a couple of phenomena here. The first is, for Republicans in Congress, there has been a devil's bargain with Trump. And it was expressed not long after the election by John Thune, a senator from South Dakota. He said, well, yeah, the guy's going to say things every day that we don't like, and he'll embarrass us. But if we can get our legislative package through, hey, that's okay. So it's basically, this guy doesn't care about policy. He'll sign anything we put in front of him. And as long as that's the case, we're not going to go after him. Now, they may not be able to get anything in front of him. And he is going to turn on them when they fail to get legislation through, as he's already shown that he will. So we may see a civil war going on there. But there's still this sense that we can use him to our own benefit, and of course we can get the judges we want, which is a truly important part of this. The second part of it is, parse out that 35 to 40% approval for Trump. His approval among Democrats is 5 to 8%. His approval among independents is about 35%. Its approval among Republicans is 85%. That's their voters. And they're scared to death that if they turn on Trump, if they do what you would hope a legislator would do, that the backlash will work against them. And they know that that would mean Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, Laura Ingraham, Mark Levin, Alex Jones, and others turning their full force on them, and some of the funders who are behind Trump, the Mercer family and others, funding campaigns against them. So there's an intimidation factor there as well. But it means, you know, you could look back on the Nixon impeachment effort and see people emerging. A Howard Baker, a Hugh Scott, a Barry Goldwater. I don't see a Howard Baker, and I don't see a Hugh Scott.
Linda, over here. Say your name. Larissa Bonfante, New York University. You talked about checks and balances, and I like what you said, that the norms are what counts. You didn't say anything about the judiciary, which seems to be remarkably independent in some cases. And I know in Italy it was the judiciary that was independent, that was able to change things at a certain point. Could you say something
Sure.
about that?
It's certainly been heartening to see many federal judges step up here and put some limits on the executive orders that emerged right away. And by the way, here again, you know, those of us in the policy world talk a lot about the regular order. And there's a regular order in how you make policy in Congress, and there's been a regular order in how you do executive actions. Always in the past, if a president were going to do an executive order, they would run it by the Office of Legal Counsel. They would have certain other vetting points. They just slapped these together and were actually very forthright in saying what their goals were, which has been used against them. So we've seen this with some judges. But what we also know is that tribalism has hit the judiciary in a big way as well. When I talk to Supreme Court justices, and Linda's seen this as well, I am sure, they all defend their institution and say, well, look, 80%, 90% of our decisions are unanimous or near unanimous. But all the ones that really count are 5-4. And we know how they're going to go. And I watched, as we all did, the hearings with Neil Gorsuch, and how wonderful he is, and how, of course, he steps back and he only makes decisions based on the facts in front of him, and his clerks said what a wonderful person he was. And I remember when Sam Alito's clerk said what a wonderful person he was. And as a justice, he's been nothing but a down-the-line ideologue. And I will be stunned if we see anything else from Neil Gorsuch. He was vetted in that fashion. So, and we're going to see an attempt to move through other judges who have been vetted for their ideology. And so over time, we're going to see these decisions made more on a different set of lines. And over time, that may erode the independence and the legitimacy of the judiciary. Right now, we're seeing something different. And you know, when I talk about autocracy, one of the things that worries me is, of course, we have a president who talks about so-called judges and says if anything bad happens, blame the judges. That's not a very good phenomenon, and you can imagine at some point basically shutting down the judiciary if we're thinking in apocalyptic terms.
Okay.
Frank Stewart, New York. I hate to come out sounding as if I'm defending Trump, but don't you think there's something to be said for his idea that the American Constitution is rather archaic? The Electoral College is an obvious example.
Yeah.
A less obvious one is the way the Senate is elected. As you know, in the early republic, the states were much more equal in population than they are now. I won't give other examples, but I'm sure you're aware of.
Yeah.
What's your opinion?
So when Donald Trump refers to the Constitution as archaic, that's not what he's referring to, though. But I agree with you. And I think when the Constitution was set up, the whole nature of the Electoral College, which of course was supposed to be a deliberative body, it was supposed to be picking people who then would choose a president and, read what Hamilton wrote even back in just after 1800, referring, of course, to Aaron Burr. But it was, we could end up with a president just like Donald Trump. And the electors will keep that from happening because they're not going to pick a narcissistic sociopath or a kleptocrat as a president. But that's gone by the boards. And now we have a situation where there is an enormous bias towards small, homogeneous, white, rural states and a much larger imbalance. And you know, you go through 1824 was the first election in which popular votes mattered in any sense at all. Move that forward 140 years or so, and you have basically 3 elections where, in some fashion or another, you had a president elected who didn't win the popular vote. And a couple of instances, it was you couldn't really look at it the way we do in a contemporary fashion. The last 5 elections, it was 7% of all the elections. Last 5, 40%. 2 elections out of 5. And that could be a more common phenomenon. Now, the first time it happened in 2000, the public reaction was, you know, those are the rules, and it's like a tennis match. It's not the number of games you win, it's the number of sets you win. It's okay. The second time, not quite the same. You get another election or 2 where the popular will is thwarted, and the whole legitimacy of the election system is going to be weighted down. And the Senate, you're absolutely right. We now live in a world where, with the filibuster, 11% of the population can block anything from happening. And we also have that fundamental imbalance towards a set of smaller states. And as you said, the ratio of population between the smallest and the largest was like this at the time of the founding, and now it's like that. And that's not healthy. But you know, when the president talks about that, it's not like he's talking in thoughtful terms. It is basically, this is archaic because that damn Congress isn't doing what I told them to do. And those judges are not doing what they should be doing. So it's much more an authoritarian reaction to the Constitution rather than a scholarly reaction to the Constitution.
Last question, I think, in the balcony.
Yes, Louise Hanson, Long Island, New York.
One down there.
I basically do agree. No, pick it up. Oh, okay. To make the question short, why did Congress, or why was there, given the proclivities of the Republicans to want to get something out of Trump? Well, they can. Why did they not go through with the change to the health care law, Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, which I agree was atrocious? Did they see that as so atrocious that they would suffer if they had pushed it through?
So I can give you a long answer on the history of tribal reaction to Obamacare, which was 60 votes to repeal, no votes to replace because they didn't have a replace plan, and that was because every element of the plan that they would have was in Obamacare, and so they were kind of at a loss. But they fundamentally slapped this together in a month, and it's a flawed and inadequate plan. And one, tribalism, the approval for Obamacare has gone up sharply since he left the presidency, because now it's not seen in quite the same way. 2, people are realizing what they got, and they don't want to give it up. And there are enough members of the House, because they only want to do this with Republicans, and their margin is fairly narrow, scared to death of their own constituent reaction to it, that they weren't going to vote for it. Now, one of my pet peeves is journalists keep calling them moderates. There are no moderates. These are people who, by previous standards, would have been at the right end of their party. Now, the right end of the party is over there. It's a radical end of the party. But they're more pragmatic when it comes to something like this. And when you are going to work only within your own party, trying to do a parliamentary approach in a system and a culture that won't accept that very easily, and you then try to appeal to your radical members, you're going to lose some of those people whose districts are more vulnerable and who don't want to give up their political careers right now. So they're in a box on that front. But that doesn't mean they won't at some point pass something pretty horrific. And if that happens, the 2018 elections are going to really result, I think, in a huge backlash.
Do we have time for one more or not?
We had this
Yes, okay.
young man sitting there patiently for
Erwin.
so long.
Very young. Thank you very much. It was a great presentation to, I would say, a fairly sympathetic audience,
Yeah.
without having taken a poll. But what I was curious about is, what is your Sorry? What I was curious about is, what has your experience been as a resident scholar of the American Enterprise Institute?
It's a question I get a lot. I taught for 13 years at Catholic University. So I was a Jew at Catholic University. And then I went to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm used to being a fish out of water in some ways. I've been there longer than anybody else. And what I can tell you is that in all the years that I've been there, starting part-time in 1978, full-time in 1984, not once has anyone in a position of authority said to me, "You can't say that. You can't do that. Even, how can you say that, or how can you do that?" So I've had a level of academic freedom that I didn't have in university, to tell you the truth. And I have a lot of colleagues who are smart and not dogmatic, along with a few who are not so smart and some who are really dogmatic, it's true. But that's an experience that you'll find at any university as well. To be perfectly frank as well, the books that I did with Tom Mann, who's been at Brookings and who's been my writing partner for more than 40 years, if those books had been done by two people from Brookings, they probably would have sunk without a trace. The fact that one was done by somebody at AEI and one at Brookings got them more attention and more resonance. So it's worked for me, and I continue to be pretty happy there, and especially because our new building has a fitness center in the basement.
Norm, thank you. That was great.